With all the forms we've learned to represent linear functions, we can now actually do a comparison of all of them, and we can answer some questions. So what we need to know at this point is that all the linear equations, no matter what form they're in, they can eventually be written as y equals mx plus b. And we would always just focus on the two most important elements, the y-intercept and the slope. Okay, and we want to know that the y-intercept is just the same as initial value, just another way to call it, and the slope is the same that constant rate of change. Okay, so now sometimes a function, even without its equation, it's given in words, in description, but we still know that it's a linear function. So for example, the first one says, if the y-intercept is 2 and the slope is -2, well, that's a linear equation, and we can write it as y equals -ax plus 2. So we know that it's saying that, okay, y-intercept is 2, and in the equation mx plus b is the y-intercept, and the slope is -8, so m is 8. I'm sorry, -8. Now make sure that we know whichever number that's multiplying the x, that is the slope. It doesn't matter if it's written first or second. If it's multiplying the x, that's the slope. So in the second example, we can see that, okay, -3 is multiplying the x, so that makes it the slope, and -5 would be the y-intercept, b. Okay, so the trickier ones are the table ones and the graph ones because they're not very straightforward. So for example, in the table one, how do we find the y-intercept? Well, by definition, a y-intercept is when x equals 0 because the point is always 0, comma something. So in the table, if it tells us when x is 0, then we're gonna then use that y value that's paired with it to be our y-intercept, b. So the slope, that is a pattern we need to find. Okay, so we need to do two things here. One is to see how y is changing. So in this case, it's changing by -6. And the other thing is look at how x is changing. Because, and here's +2. Because the slope is the rate of change of the change in y over the change in x. You have to find a unit change. So just looking at the change in y is not enough. You have to divide it by how many x is also changing to get like a unit change. So in that case then, we're going to do -6 over +2. So -3 is actually how much it's changing per unit, and that's going to be the slope. Okay, so then on a graph problem, okay, so y-intercept is actually pretty easy to find because just by how it looks, right? Y-intercept is where the line crosses the y-axis, and it's 5 here. Now the slope, though, we have to look at it with another point, because if you just, there's only one point, there's not a direction, you're not going anywhere, so there's no change. We need to find another point to see how much is changing. Okay, so we want to make a connection here. Okay, so we want to know that this formula here is actually the same as rise over run, right? Because the rise is to change in the the y direction, which is up and down, and the run is to change in the x direction, which is left and right. Okay, so it's consistent with the change in y over change in x. Okay, so let's find another point on this graph, and we want to make sure that we find the point that we know the coordinates of, because like if we find this point, we can really tell where it is, so we don't use it. We'll use a point such as this one on a perfect corner, because we can tell, okay, that's -2 or comma +1. It's pretty easy to see, right? Okay, so then we're gonna now count how much is rising, how much is running. So rise is when you go one point to another. So if you go from the beginning point here to that point, you're gonna go down 1, 2, 3, 4. So downwards 4. So it's negative. That's the rise. And then run, you're gonna go then 1, 2 this way. It's to the left, so it's gonna be negative 2 steps. Okay, so the up and right, they're the positive directions. That's why here we're going to do negative 4 over negative 2. So that's 2. That's the slope or the rate of change. Another way to do it is we can look at how it's changing by the coordinates. If you're not a visual person, you like algebra better, so you can just use it on the coordinates. So first we're going to write the coordinates of both points. Okay, so the y-intercept is 0, 5. Okay, and then we're going to set it up as the change in y. So y, x comma y, right? So 5 and 1, those are the y's. And we want to make sure that direction's consistent. So if this is your first point, that's your second point, you have to do that for both y and x. So a way that I like to kind of help myself to, keep the consistent direction is to do up, down, up, down. So okay, so up, down, up, down. And on the x direction, same way, up, down, up, down. That way we're not messing up with the direction. Okay, so if we simplify that, 4 over 2 is still going to give us 2. So you can see that whichever way you do it, it's still going to give you the same slope.